The first thing Captain Daniel Mercer noticed wasn't the building. It was the road. A smooth strip of fresh asphalt cut straight through the middle of his pasture like a scar. Just 6 months earlier, before deployment, that stretch of land had been open grass where his cattle grazed under a line of oak trees. Now a wide emergency access lane ran from the highway to the center of his ranch. Mercer slowed his truck at the top of the hill and stared. At the bottom of the road sat a brand new red fire station. 2 fire engines gleamed in the sun. The concrete apron was still bright and clean. A tall metal sign stood beside the driveway. Riverstone Community Fire Response Station. For a moment Mercer wondered if he had taken the wrong road. But the old wooden fence was still there. The creek still curved through the far pasture. And the station sat exactly where his equipment barn used to stand. Construction trailers. Utility poles. A waterline trench. Mercer knew enough about infrastructure to estimate quickly. Road grading. Concrete slab. Electrical service. Municipal water. Whoever built this had spent well over $1 million. On land he had never sold. As he stepped out of the truck, a woman in a bright blazer walked across the pavement toward him. Linda Cartwright, president of the Riverstone HOA. She folded her arms and looked at the ranch behind him. "You should be proud," she said calmly. "Your empty land finally became useful." Mercer didn't argue. He simply looked at the survey stakes near the edge of the pavement, and then at the fire station doors. Because one thought had already formed in his mind. Someone had approved something they didn't actually have the authority to approve. And if that was true, how did an entire fire station get built on his ranch while he was deployed? If you enjoy stories where quiet patience defeats arrogant power, make sure you're subscribed and stay until the end. Because in this case, the HOA believed their paperwork made them untouchable. What they didn't realize was that one overlooked rule could undo everything they built on his land. Captain Daniel Mercer had always believed that land should be treated with patience. He wasn't the type to rush decisions. In the Army, he served as a logistics officer, someone responsible for planning supply routes, tracking equipment, and making sure systems worked the way they were supposed to. That kind of work trained a person to notice details most people ignored. 8 years earlier, Mercer had used most of his savings to purchase the 70-acre ranch on the edge of Pine Hollow County. The land had once belonged to his grandfather decades before. When the original family property was divided and sold off, Mercer made a quiet promise to himself that one day he would buy a piece of it back. It took years of deployments and careful saving, but eventually he did. The ranch wasn't fancy. A weathered wooden barn. A small equipment shed. Rolling pasture bordered by oak trees. But to Mercer, it represented something stable, something that would still exist long after military service ended. For years the land stayed quiet. Then things around it started to change. A real estate developer purchased several hundred acres nearby and began building a large suburban community called Riverstone Estates. Within 3 years, paved streets and large houses replaced open farmland along the ranch boundary. With the neighborhood came something else. An HOA. At first the association didn't bother Mercer much. His ranch was outside the subdivision, and legally the HOA had no authority over his property. Still, a few small issues surfaced. Occasional letters about fencing visibility near the road. Questions about shared drainage along the boundary line. A suggestion that Mercer consider selling the corner parcel for community improvements. Most of the messages came from the same person. Linda Cartwright, the president of the Riverstone HOA. Cartwright had once worked in real estate development and ran the association with strict confidence. She believed strongly in organized neighborhoods, controlled growth, and clear authority structures. Whenever Mercer spoke with her, the conversations were polite, but something about them always felt calculated. 6 months earlier, just before Mercer deployed overseas again, Cartwright had briefly mentioned an idea during one conversation. The neighborhood had been discussing emergency response improvements. Specifically, a satellite fire station somewhere near the main highway. At the time, Mercer hadn't thought much about it. His land sat at the intersection of two county roads, but no one had ever formally asked to purchase or lease it. And Mercer certainly never signed anything. Now, standing on the hill above his ranch and looking down at the fire station sitting in the middle of his pasture, one uncomfortable realization began to settle in. Somewhere along the line, someone had decided his permission wasn't necessary. The next morning, Captain Daniel Mercer drove into the Riverstone Estates community office. The HOA building sat beside the neighborhood clubhouse, a polished brick structure with neat landscaping and a row of identical mailboxes outside. It looked more like a small bank than a homeowners association. Inside, the receptionist barely looked surprised when Mercer introduced himself. "Mrs. Cartwright is expecting you," she said. Linda Cartwright stood at the far end of the conference room when Mercer walked in. Two other HOA board members sat beside her, along with a stack of folders spread across the table. Cartwright gestured toward a chair. "Captain Mercer," she said. "I assume you've seen the new fire response station." Mercer remained standing. "I saw it," he replied calmly. "What I haven't seen is how it ended up on my land." Cartwright slid a document across the table. "A community safety easement," she said. "Approved by the Riverstone Board and acknowledged by the county planning office." Mercer looked down at the paperwork but didn't touch it yet. "You approved construction on property that isn't part of your HOA," he said. Cartwright smiled slightly. "The county approved it. We simply coordinated the request." Mercer finally picked up the document. It was a survey map and easement agreement, stamped with county permit approvals. According to the paperwork, a portion of land near the road had been designated as a community infrastructure access zone. Mercer studied the page for several seconds. Then he set it back down. "Do you have the land transfer authorization?" he asked. Cartwright folded her arms. "The station benefits everyone in the area," she said. "Including you." Mercer didn't argue. Instead, he asked for copies of every document connected to the construction project, permits, survey records, and board meeting approvals. Cartwright agreed without hesitation. 2 days later, a certified envelope arrived at Mercer's ranch mailbox. Inside was a formal HOA notice. The letter stated that Mercer's property had been used to support community emergency infrastructure, and under HOA development cost-sharing provisions he was responsible for contributing toward project expenses. The total listed amount was $47,000. If payment was not received within 30 days, the association reserved the right to place a lien against his property. Mercer sat at his kitchen table and read the easement document again. This time he noticed something that immediately stopped him. The parcel number printed on the survey map did not match his land records, which raised a much bigger question. If the land description was wrong, what exactly had the county approved? Captain Daniel Mercer didn't respond to the HOA letter immediately. Instead, he began doing what years of military logistics had trained him to do: reconstruct the system. Every project, every supply chain, every operation depended on documentation. If something didn't make sense, the answer was always somewhere in the paperwork. So Mercer started with the county clerk's office. 2 days later he sat at a public records terminal inside the Pine Hollow County Administration Building, quietly scrolling through digital files connected to the Riverstone Fire Station project. At first glance, everything looked official. There were Planning Commission meeting notes, infrastructure approval forms, a development request submitted by the Riverstone HOA. Then he opened the construction permit. The permit authorized the building of a satellite fire response station near the Riverstone Estates entrance. It listed electrical hookups, municipal water access, and road grading approval. But one line caught Mercer's attention. Property owner, Riverstone Community Development Parcel. Mercer leaned back in his chair. He had never sold a parcel to Riverstone. And he certainly never transferred ownership. He opened another file, the project survey map. According to the diagram, the fire station had been built on a section labeled Community Access Lot. Mercer recognized the shape immediately. It was the corner of his ranch. But the parcel identification number was slightly different. Just one digit off. That small error meant the county system believed the land belonged to a different legal parcel entirely. Mercer printed the documents and drove back to his ranch. That evening he spread 3 papers across the kitchen table. His original property deed, the county parcel registry map, the HOA easement survey. Side by side, the mistake became obvious. Someone had submitted paperwork using a nearly identical parcel number, close enough to pass basic review, but legally connected to land that didn't exist anymore after a boundary consolidation years earlier. Mercer didn't assume it was intentional, but it explained how construction had moved forward. The county believed the HOA had authority over the land, which meant the fire station permits were approved under false property ownership information. The next morning another certified letter arrived. This one from the HOA's attorney. The language was less friendly. Because Mercer had not responded to the original notice, the association now considered him non-compliant with community infrastructure obligations. The letter outlined new financial figures. $47,000 infrastructure participation. $12,000 administrative penalties. $8,400 legal processing costs. Total claimed balance, $67,400. The attorney warned that continued refusal could result in a lien being placed against Mercer's ranch property. Mercer folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the county records. The numbers didn't worry him. What mattered was the timeline. He opened the permit again and checked the approval date. Then he looked at the survey submission. Something else immediately stood out. The county had approved the fire station construction permit 3 weeks before the land survey was finalized, which meant the building project had technically been authorized before the property boundaries were even verified. Mercer looked out the kitchen window toward the fire station lights glowing faintly across his pasture. Then he made a quiet note in his notebook. Because if the permit came first, and the land verification came later, someone had rushed the approval process. A week later, Captain Daniel Mercer received an email from the Riverstone HOA board. It was a formal notice inviting him to attend the next monthly community meeting. The message explained that the board intended to discuss ongoing concerns regarding the fire response station project and community cooperation. Mercer knew exactly what that meant. They wanted the discussion to happen in front of the neighborhood. The meeting took place in the Riverstone Clubhouse auditorium. Nearly 50 residents filled the rows of chairs when Mercer walked in. Word had already spread that the returning soldier was trying to challenge the new fire station. Linda Cartwright stood at the front of the room beside a projector screen displaying a photograph of the new building. When Mercer entered, several heads turned. Cartwright waited until the room quieted. As many of you know, she began, Riverstone Estates recently partnered with county officials to build a much-needed emergency response station. This project will reduce fire response times across the entire area. The screen changed to a slide showing fire trucks parked in front of the building. Unfortunately, she continued, we've encountered unexpected resistance from a nearby property owner. Several people glanced toward Mercer. Cartwright didn't raise her voice. She spoke calmly, almost professionally. Captain Mercer's land happened to be located in the ideal position for this project. During his absence, the association worked with county planners to ensure this facility could serve both Riverstone residents and the surrounding rural area. A man in the second row raised his hand. So the fire station might close because of him, he asked. Cartwright sighed as if the situation disappointed her. We certainly hope not, she said. But cooperation requires responsibility. Another slide appeared. Project infrastructure costs. Construction support. Road development. Waterline extension. Electrical installation. Total shared infrastructure cost, $248,000. Cartwright pointed toward the final line. Captain Mercer's parcel benefits directly from these improvements. Under county development cost-sharing guidelines, his portion comes to approximately $83,000. Several residents murmured. One woman near the back said loudly, "That seems fair." Mercer remained seated the entire time. He didn't interrupt. He didn't respond. He simply wrote notes in a small black notebook. Cartwright finally turned toward him. "Captain Mercer," she said, "would you like to address the community?" Mercer stood slowly. "I only have one question," he said calmly. "What question is that?" Cartwright replied. Mercer looked toward the projector screen. "I'd like to see the original county development request file," he said. The room grew quiet. Cartwright's expression tightened slightly. "That file has already been reviewed by the planning office," she said. Mercer nodded. "I understand," he replied. "I'd just like to see the version that was submitted before construction began." The silence lasted several seconds. Then Cartwright cleared her throat. "I'm sure the county records department can provide whatever documents you're looking for." Mercer nodded once and sat back down. The meeting ended shortly afterward, with many residents still convinced the issue was simply a financial dispute. But as Mercer walked out of the building, he knew something Cartwright clearly didn't. Because if the county development request file showed what he suspected, it would reveal exactly who approved the use of land that wasn't theirs to approve. That night, Captain Daniel Mercer parked his truck at the far edge of the ranch road and shut off the engine. The fire station lights glowed across the pasture. Even from a distance he could hear the low hum of the building's generators and the occasional metallic clang of equipment inside the garage bays. Firefighters moved in and out of the building as if it had always been there. For a moment, Mercer simply watched. The structure itself didn't make him angry. If anything, he respected the purpose. Emergency stations saved lives. Faster response times mattered in rural counties where fires could spread for miles before help arrived. What bothered him wasn't the building. It was how it got there. In the Army, Mercer had spent years managing supply systems that stretched across entire continents. Convoys, fuel depots, aircraft shipments, every operation depended on a chain of approvals that had to be exact. One missing authorization could shut down an entire operation. One incorrect document could collapse a mission. That discipline had become second nature to him. Which was why the situation in front of him felt so wrong. Someone had approved construction on land they didn't own. Someone had pushed paperwork through the county system quickly enough that nobody stopped to verify the details. And now the people responsible were acting as if the mistake simply didn't matter. Mercer leaned back against the tailgate of his truck and looked across the dark pasture again. For a moment he considered the simplest option. Pay the money. Let the county keep the station. Walk away from the problem. But the thought faded almost immediately. Because this wasn't about $80,000. It was about authority. If organizations could quietly take land whenever the owner happened to be away, the entire system meant nothing. Mercer pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled to a number he hadn't called in years. The legal assistance office on base. When the duty officer answered, Mercer explained the situation briefly. There was a pause on the line. Then the officer asked a single question. "Captain Mercer, were you on active deployment orders when this construction started?" Mercer looked across the pasture toward the fire station. "Yes," he said. Another pause followed. This one felt different. Because the officer's next words carried a tone Mercer hadn't heard yet in this entire situation. "Then you may want to come see us," the officer said. "Because that detail changes everything." 2 weeks after the community meeting, the next letter arrived. This one came by certified priority mail. Captain Daniel Mercer already knew what it was before he opened it. The return address belonged to the Riverstone HOA legal office. Inside was a formal notice stamped with county filing numbers. The association had officially initiated a property lien process against Mercer's ranch. The document outlined the new balance the HOA claimed he owed. Infrastructure participation, $83,000. Legal enforcement fees, $26,400. Administrative penalties and late charges, $31,600. Total claimed liability, $141,000. But the final paragraph made the real threat clear. If the balance remained unpaid, the association reserved the right to pursue civil enforcement of the easement agreement, including potential property sale proceedings to recover the debt. Mercer folded the document and set it on the kitchen table beside the growing stack of paperwork. Across the room, the red lights of the fire station reflected faintly through the window. From the outside, everything looked settled. The building was operational. The county had approved the permits. The HOA had legal paperwork backing their claims. Even the county clerk Mercer spoke with earlier had quietly suggested that challenging the project would be extremely difficult. "You might want to negotiate a settlement," the clerk had said. Most people would have taken that advice. After all, the station was already built. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been invested. No court wanted to shut down a functioning emergency service building. The situation made Mercer look cornered. A lien on his property. Mounting legal costs. An entire neighborhood convinced he was blocking a safety project. From the outside, it looked like the HOA had already won. But Mercer wasn't focused on the lien notice. Instead, he opened the envelope that had arrived from the county records office earlier that morning. Inside was the complete development request file for the fire station project. Permits. Survey drafts. Planning office recommendations. Mercer flipped slowly through the stack until he reached the final section. Then he stopped. Because one document that should have been there wasn't. And without that document, the entire project approval process suddenly looked incomplete. Captain Daniel Mercer spread the county development file across his kitchen table. Every page had an official stamp. Planning approval. Environmental clearance. Construction permits. Utility installation authorization. On the surface, the project looked completely legitimate. But Mercer had spent enough years working with military logistics paperwork to know one thing. Large projects always leave long paper trails. Especially when government land use approvals are involved. He began organizing the documents by date. First came the HOA's initial project proposal to the county planning office. Then the planning department's recommendation to approve a community emergency response station near the Riverstone Estates entrance. After that came the infrastructure permit, authorizing road grading and utility connections. Mercer continued turning pages. Survey draft. Construction contractor license verification. County building permit. He reached the final section of the file. And stopped again. There should have been one more document. The land authorization record. Anytime a public facility was built on private property, the county required a specific filing, either a land purchase agreement, a permanent easement, or a government acquisition order. But none of those appeared in the packet. Instead, the file jumped directly from the planning recommendation to the building permit approval. Mercer leaned back in his chair. That meant the county approved construction without a finalized legal transfer of land rights. Which shouldn't have been possible. Unless the county believed something else had already been verified. Mercer picked up the survey map again and looked closely at the parcel number printed in the corner. The same number Cartwright had shown him weeks earlier. One digit off. Just enough to point to a property classification that technically fell under community development land instead of his private ranch. Mercer set the document down slowly. Then he reached for his phone and called the county records desk. When the clerk answered, Mercer asked for something extremely specific. "Could you check if there's a service member property review exemption attached to the Riverstone fire station file?" The clerk paused. "Sir," she said after a moment, "I'm not seeing anything like that in the system." Mercer nodded quietly. Because if that review had never been filed, then the HOA hadn't just rushed the paperwork. They may have triggered a federal protection violation without realizing it. The next morning, Captain Daniel Mercer drove to the legal assistance office at the nearby military base. The building was plain, just another administrative structure among dozens of others, but inside it handled something extremely important. Service member legal protections. Mercer sat across from a military legal officer named Major Rachel Holloway and placed the entire county development file on the desk. Holloway reviewed the paperwork quietly. She didn't rush. She didn't comment right away. She simply studied each document the same way Mercer had studied them the night before. Permit approval. Planning recommendation. Infrastructure authorization. Finally, she reached the survey map. Her eyes paused on the parcel number. Then she looked up. "Captain," she said, "when exactly did construction begin?" Mercer handed her a printed timeline he had assembled from the permit file. Road grading permit approval. Utility trench authorization. Foundation inspection date. Holloway compared the dates to something on her computer. Then she asked another question. "When did your deployment orders begin?" Mercer answered immediately. March 17th. Holloway typed the date into the system. Another silence followed. But this silence felt different. Because when Holloway leaned back in her chair, the tone in her voice had changed. "You're protected under the Service Members Civil Relief Act," she said. Mercer nodded slightly. He had heard of the law before, but mostly in the context of mortgage protections. Holloway slid a legal reference guide across the desk. "The SCRA does more than protect loans," she explained. "It also restricts certain legal actions against deployed service members." She turned the page and pointed to a section highlighted in yellow. When a property owner is on active deployment orders, local governments and private entities cannot take specific actions affecting that property without court review. Mercer studied the paragraph. Holloway summarized it clearly. No forced sales. No liens. No permanent easements. And no development actions that significantly alter the property. Mercer looked back at the construction timeline. The road had been graded 2 weeks after his deployment began. The foundation was poured 1 month later. The building permit was finalized while he was already overseas. None of it had gone through a court. Mercer looked up. "So they needed judicial approval first?" Holloway nodded. "Yes," she said. "And I'm not seeing any record that they requested one." She turned back to the documents. The county likely assumed the HOA had legitimate land rights. "Which they didn't," Mercer said. "Exactly." Holloway tapped the survey map again. "This incorrect parcel number probably slipped through the system because it resembled a valid development lot. That mistake allowed the planning department to treat the land as community-owned property." Mercer leaned forward. "And once construction started, everyone assumed the paperwork had already been verified," Holloway finished. That explained the entire chain reaction. The HOA had submitted a survey referencing a parcel number close to Mercer's ranch but technically categorized as development land. County officials processed the request under that assumption. Permits moved forward. Contractors started building. And because Mercer was deployed overseas, no one challenged the mistake in time. But the moment Mercer returned, and the correct property ownership surfaced, the entire project suddenly fell into a completely different legal category. Holloway closed the file. "If this case goes before a judge," she said calmly, "the first question will be whether your deployment status triggered SCRA protections." Mercer already knew the answer. "Yes." Holloway nodded. "Then the second question becomes whether the HOA and county sought proper authorization before altering your property." She tapped the empty space in the file where the land authorization document should have been. "And based on these records, they didn't." Mercer sat quietly for a moment. Outside the window, helicopters moved across the distant training field. Everything about the situation now made sense. The HOA board had believed they were acting within normal community development procedures. The county planning office had trusted the parcel number on the survey. No one had realized the project involved the property of a currently deployed service member, which meant the entire fire station construction had proceeded without the federal review required by law. Holloway leaned forward again. "I'll be honest with you," she said. "This is a serious mistake." "How serious?" Mercer asked. Holloway opened another legal reference on her computer. If a court determines that SCRA protections were violated, any actions taken against the property can be declared legally invalid. Mercer understood the implication immediately. The easement, the lien, the entire construction approval chain. All of it could potentially be void. Holloway continued. And if the county determines the development permits were issued based on incorrect land ownership information. She paused. Then the fire station itself may have been built without lawful authorization. Mercer exhaled slowly. For weeks the HOA had spoken with absolute confidence. They believed the paperwork made the project permanent. But now Mercer understood something they didn't. The system they trusted had a higher layer of authority. Federal protection law. And if that law had been ignored, even accidentally, the consequences could ripple through every permit connected to the project. Holloway closed the file and slid it back toward Mercer. "The next step is simple," she said. "We request an emergency review hearing with the county." Mercer stood and gathered the documents. As he walked toward the door, Holloway added one final thought. "You should expect resistance," she said. "Projects like this involve a lot of money." Mercer nodded. He had already estimated the cost. Road construction, utility connections, concrete structure. The total investment easily exceeded $1.5 million, which meant if the permits collapsed, the liability wouldn't just fall on the HOA. It could reach the county itself. 3 days later, the Pine Hollow County Administration Building scheduled an emergency hearing. For the first time since the fire station opened, the HOA board would have to explain exactly how they received permission to build on land they didn't own. And as the hearing date approached, one uncomfortable realization began spreading through the Riverstone HOA leadership. Because if Captain Mercer's legal argument was correct, then the fire station they proudly celebrated could soon be recognized for something very different. Not as a community achievement, but as a $1 million mistake built on the wrong land. The hearing took place inside the Pine Hollow County Administration Building. It wasn't a courtroom, but it felt close enough. A long chamber with polished wooden desks faced a raised platform where the county review panel sat. Behind them hung the county seal and the American flag. The room was already crowded when Captain Daniel Mercer walked in. Several Riverstone residents had shown up. A few local reporters stood along the back wall. At the front table sat 3 members of the Riverstone HOA board, including Linda Cartwright. Next to them sat the county planning director and a representative from the fire department. Stacks of documents covered the desks. Millions of dollars in construction had led to this moment. The panel chair, Judge Harold Benton, adjusted his glasses and looked across the room. "This hearing concerns the Riverstone Fire Response Station and the property dispute raised by Captain Mercer," he said. His voice carried calmly through the chamber. "We're here to determine whether the construction approvals issued by Pine Hollow County complied with applicable law." He turned toward Mercer. "Captain Mercer, you may begin." Mercer stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. Instead, he walked to the display table and placed several documents under the overhead projector. The first was his property deed. "This is the registered ownership record for my ranch," Mercer said. The panel nodded as the document appeared on the large screen. Next, Mercer placed the construction permit timeline beside it. "These are the dates the Riverstone fire station permits were approved and construction began." The panel studied the timeline. Then Mercer placed one final document on the table. His active deployment orders. "These were my orders during the time construction began." A quiet murmur spread across the room. Judge Benton leaned forward. Captain Mercer, he said, please explain why this timeline matters. Mercer nodded once. When the fire station construction began, I was deployed overseas under active duty orders. He paused briefly. Under federal law, property actions affecting deployed service members require judicial review before they can proceed. One of the county attorneys shifted in his chair. Mercer continued calmly. Specifically under the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Now the room grew completely silent. Judge Benton looked toward the county legal advisor. The advisor flipped through a binder and whispered something to the judge. Mercer then placed another document on the projector. The Riverstone HOA easement survey. This survey was used to justify the development approval, Mercer said. He pointed to the parcel number printed in the corner. This parcel number does not belong to the Riverstone HOA. Another document appeared on the screen. The county parcel registry map. The difference became immediately visible. The survey referenced a development lot that technically no longer existed after land consolidation. But the physical coordinates matched Mercer's ranch property, which meant the fire station had been approved using incorrect ownership information. Judge Benton looked toward the county planning director. Did the county verify the land ownership before issuing the permit? The director hesitated. Our office relied on the survey submitted with the development request. And no further verification occurred, the judge asked. The director shook his head slowly. No, Your Honor. Linda Cartwright finally leaned forward. The station was built for public safety, she said firmly. Riverstone residents funded infrastructure improvements and worked with the county planning office in good faith. Judge Benton raised a hand. Mrs. Cartwright, he said calmly, the issue before us is not the purpose of the building. It is the authority under which it was constructed. The judge turned back to Mercer. Captain Mercer, is there anything further you'd like to add? Mercer paused for a moment. Then he spoke the single sentence that ended the room's uncertainty. Public safety doesn't grant permission to take private land. The words weren't loud, but the effect was immediate. Several residents shifted uncomfortably. Because the argument that had carried the HOA through weeks of public meetings, community benefit, safety improvements, shared responsibility, suddenly sounded very different inside a legal hearing. The judge turned to the county attorney. What is the county's legal exposure if the Service Members Civil Relief Act applies here? The attorney cleared his throat. If the court determines that federal deployment protections were triggered, the permits issued for the development may be considered legally defective. And the easement? The judge asked. The easement would be invalid, the attorney replied. Judge Benton looked toward the fire department representative. If the permits collapse, what happens to the station? The representative answered carefully. The facility could continue operating temporarily while the county negotiates a lawful land agreement, or it may need to be relocated. A quiet tension filled the room, because everyone understood what that meant. The fire station sitting proudly on Mercer's ranch could suddenly become $1 million liability. Judge Benton reviewed the documents again. Then he leaned back in his chair. The panel will recess briefly before issuing a ruling, he said. The gavel struck softly against the desk. The room erupted into quiet conversations. HOA board members whispered urgently among themselves. Residents checked their phones. Reporters stepped into the hallway. Mercer remained seated. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak. He simply waited. Because after weeks of accusations, meetings, and legal threats, the outcome of the entire conflict now rested on one question: whether the law protecting deployed service members would outweigh the authority the HOA believed it had. 10 minutes later, the panel returned to the chamber. Judge Benton adjusted the documents in front of him. Then he looked across the room. And everyone knew the decision was about to be announced. When the review panel returned to the chamber, the conversations in the room faded immediately. Judge Harold Benton took his seat and opened the folder in front of him. The other panel members settled beside him, their expressions serious. Everyone in the room understood what the decision meant. Not just for Captain Daniel Mercer, but for the entire Riverstone project. Judge Benton adjusted his glasses and began reading. After reviewing the submitted documents, the panel finds that the construction of the Riverstone Community Fire Response Station occurred on property owned by Captain Daniel Mercer. He paused briefly. And that this construction began while the property owner was on active military deployment. The room remained silent. Under the Servicemembers Civil Relief Act, Benton continued, legal actions affecting the property of a deployed service member require judicial review before proceeding. He turned a page. No such review occurred in this case. A quiet ripple moved through the audience. Linda Cartwright leaned forward in her chair, but said nothing. Judge Benton continued. The panel further finds that the construction permits issued by Pine Hollow County relied upon a survey referencing an incorrect parcel number. The judge held up the two documents. The parcel identified in the Riverstone Development Survey does not correspond with the property on which the fire station was built. The mistake was now impossible to ignore. Because without accurate ownership verification, the permit approval process had been based on faulty information. Judge Benton set the documents down. For these reasons, he said, the panel determines that the development approvals issued for the Riverstone Fire Station project were procedurally defective. The words hung in the air. Procedurally defective. In legal language, that meant the permits had never been valid in the first place. The judge continued calmly. The lien filed against Captain Mercer's property by the Riverstone Homeowners Association is hereby voided. Another page turned. All financial penalties associated with the alleged infrastructure obligations are dismissed. Cartwright's attorney whispered urgently beside her. But the ruling wasn't finished. The Riverstone HOA is ordered to reimburse Captain Mercer for legal expenses incurred during this dispute. The judge paused once more. And the county planning department is instructed to initiate an administrative review of the fire station development process. That meant investigators would examine every step of the approval chain. From the survey submission to the permit authorization. Judge Benton then addressed the most important question. The fire station currently operating on Captain Mercer's property may remain temporarily functional while the county negotiates a lawful resolution. In other words, the building wouldn't be shut down immediately. But its future now depended on Mercer's consent. If the county wanted the station to stay, they would need to purchase or lease the land legally. Judge Benton closed the file. This panel recognizes the importance of emergency infrastructure to the Riverstone community, he said. But that importance does not override the legal rights of a private property owner, particularly one serving on active military duty. The gavel tapped once against the desk. This hearing is concluded. For several seconds, no one in the room moved. Then the quiet conversations began. Residents whispered to one another. Reporters began typing rapidly on their phones. Across the room, the Riverstone HOA board members sat in stunned silence. The confident authority they had carried for weeks had disappeared in a single ruling. Mercer gathered his documents slowly. He didn't celebrate. He didn't look toward Cartwright. Instead, he simply placed the paperwork into his folder and stood. Because the decision had already done what he came for. The lien was gone. The penalties were erased. And the system that had quietly allowed his land to be taken without permission had finally corrected itself. Outside the building, the afternoon sun stretched across the courthouse steps. Mercer paused for a moment before walking to his truck. For weeks the HOA had believed the project was permanent. But now everyone in Pine Hollow County understood something very different. The fire station sitting in the middle of Mercer's ranch didn't belong to Riverstone. And until the county made things right, it never had. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere around Riverstone Estates had changed. The fire station still stood at the corner of Captain Daniel Mercer's ranch, but the tone surrounding it was very different now. County officials arrived regularly, surveyors measuring the land, legal staff reviewing documents, engineers inspecting the access road. Instead of assuming authority, every step now required Mercer's approval. The county manager eventually visited the ranch in person. This time the conversation was simple. If the community wanted to keep the station where it was, the county would need to purchase the land legally, at full market value. No easements. No HOA paperwork. A straightforward agreement. Mercer listened quietly, then nodded. Because the fight had never been about stopping the fire station. It had been about making sure the system respected the people it was supposed to protect. Word spread through the neighborhood quickly. Some residents even stopped by the ranch gate to thank him. Not for challenging the station, but for forcing the process to be done the right way. One evening Mercer stood near the old oak tree overlooking the pasture as a fire engine rolled out of the station doors. He watched it disappear down the highway. And for the first time since returning home, the ranch felt quiet again. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from shouting louder. Sometimes it comes from knowing which rule everyone else forgot.